Welcome to the Cloud Native Testing Podcast. I'm Ole Lensmar, your host, and I've spent years building testing tools like SoapUI and Swagger, and now I'm the CTO at TestCube, where we're redefining testing for the cloud native landscape. In this podcast, we invite people in this space to discuss with us the challenges, solutions, and best practices for testing in Kubernetes and beyond, covering automation, CI/CD, GitOps, and more. This podcast is proudly sponsored by TestCube. If you're interested about how to test cloud-native applications and infrastructure, subscribe and stay tuned. Now let's dive into the episode. Thank you for joining. Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's episode of the Cloud Native Testing Podcast. I have the immense and great pleasure to be joined by Daniel Bryant of a lot of fame over the years, currently head of product marketing at Syntasso. We've met a couple of times at KubeCons and other venues. It's always a huge pleasure talking to you, meeting you, Daniel. I'll hand it over to you for a short intro before we dive into things to talk about.
Thanks, Illy. Yeah, I would say don't let the label of head of product marketing just, dissuade you from paying attention to what I'm saying. So my background started, dare say, showing my age 20 or more years ago in academia, particularly around studying agents of all things, which is very big now, but it was a different kind of agents back in the day, but computer agents. And then I moved into Java development because I always enjoyed coding and saw a future career was more for me in coding than academia. So along the way, did a whole bunch of QA stuff. I think that's where you and I crossed paths early. Massive fan of SoapUI back in the day, right? When I was doing my SOAP, DL and all the craziness around XML. Like I lived and breathed XML for a number of years. And then ultimately moved into architecture and then platform engineering, built a few platforms, had some wins, had some fails along the way, worked with some amazing people, learned a whole bunch. And now I'm trying to act as the bridge between the person I was a few years ago, CTO, tech builder, and folks that are trying to get stuff done. And I have marketing in my title now, but I like to really think I'm a storyteller. I'm just helping people understand all the challenges they've got. How do they bridge them? Not just through buying my stuff, but like what approaches should they use? If I can sell some stuff along the way, that's great too, right?
Sounds awesome. Before we dive in, I just have to ask, do you still kind of meet WSDL and XML in your day-to-day interaction with people, customers, or is that an all go?
100%.
I rarely do, to be honest. But
seriously? Well, we do. So just yesterday, we're having a conversation about mainframes because customers at Syntasso are literally running the big banks quite often, right? They're running everything from Kubernetes hotness, WASM, but they're running a whole bunch of stuff on mainframes. So, and along that gamut, we see a whole lot of Java stuff. So a lot of XML, obviously Spring was my thing back in the day. It's a lot of XML and Spring, but because those systems are quite old systems, they expose interfaces via SOAP, via WSDLs, right? Oh, wow. So legit, myself, Chris and Colin are of a similar age. Chris and Colin are two of the three founders. Paula's the third founder, but Chris and Colin, I worked with them 12 years ago at Open Credo in London, and we were Java consultants. So whenever there's some kind of mention of WSDLs, the three of us always start laughing. It's a shared joke, right? We lived it. All the young folks on our team are like, WSDL what? And we're like, no, we actually built these things, right? Yeah. So myself, Chris and Colin and Paula bumped into it, but we worked on it a whole bunch.
Yeah. To your point, I mean, Maven still uses XML, and I know that we see in the testing space, XML is still very common for reporting, like the JUnit report format is. So it's still there, but I don't think it's someone. And I know I kind of miss XML schema.
I do sometimes. Because YAML is cool just stuff. A permutation sometimes, yes, right?
Yeah, let's not derail this discussion. I could talk a lot about that. But so what I do want to talk about, you've been deep in the platform engineering space for a while. And what I found interesting in regard to testing and testing in cloud native is kind of what the role of platform engineering has in spreading a testing, or not spreading, but cultivating a testing culture. Because it's platform engineering one way, so you build the platforms for your developer teams. So as part of that platform, you might want to build some testing as things into it, but it sounds a little bit like a top-down kind of thing. Or this is how you shall test versus the developers coming to you, and these are the tests we need to run, and then the platform engineering just needs to adapt that. What are your thoughts? Kind of what role does platform engineering play in that?
Yeah, the pithy answer is platform engineering plays a massive part, and it's got to be both top down and bottom up. I find when I was a consultant, you often sort of had to do that pincer movement of getting buy-in at the senior level. And folks there, it's super generic. It's how do I make money? How do I save money? How do I reduce risk? Well, testing is a big part of that risk reduction. Do you know what I mean? So that's kind of often when I was talking to the senior folks, I was like, you got to test security, scalability, reliability, all these, DRBC, right? Disaster recovery, business continuity, all that kind of good stuff. But then to your point, you can't, my experience of that, you can't really foist that on folks. Otherwise, developers are smart people, they'll step around it, they'll use other things. So you got to create platforms, tools, and the support and support the developer's workflow and make it fun to do the right thing, make it easy to do the right thing. So I think a lot of it is around that, like kind of that getting that perfect harmonization. And it is all like whichever you're kind of top down, bottom up, it's speed, safety, and scalability. We talk a lot about that at Syntasso. And I think the testing in my mind, well, affects all the things, right? But definitely that safety and that scalability, like you've got to like bake that into all the things you do, your software architecture, the code you write, the platforms, the operational side of like how are you scaling this thing dynamically. And if you don't test it, how do you know it's working? Do you know what I mean? So I think it starts kind of like from the top down from the culture, but it's got to be continually fed bottom up too.
Yeah. I think it's important with especially testing culture is and there are different schools, of course, but I've always been kind of a little bit cautious with, you shall have 80% code coverage or
Yeah.
these statements, but this kind of dichotomies, or like to say this is how you should test, you have to have this kind of test and this kind of test. But on the other hand, you do want there to be tests, right? So how do you
Yeah.
kind of balance that messaging? And I think that, and how do you get, the people, the engineering or the consumer or of your platform to embrace testing in a way that doesn't feel like it's, pushed down their throat? And I know maybe I'm exaggerating, but I could imagine that could be a challenge, and finding that balance. And I'm sure it'll be from team to team and from project to project that could vary.
Yeah, 100%. Just as you started that discussion there, I was thinking it's like good arts law. I think it is, isn't it? What's a metric seeks to be like a bad measure going forward, because everyone just games the system. And I remember back when I was a Java developer, we were told like you had to have 90% code coverage, and people blatantly gamed the system. They ran their tests with no assertions, so it was exercising all the code literally with no assertions. Obviously, folks at home, do not do that. That was a bad look. That consultant got
Very
fired when
bad.
we figured it out. But basically, that person was incentivized to have 90% code coverage. And we were running it in Jenkins back in the day, right? So the platform was all set up to run the stuff, but we actually had to have humans in the loop going like, is this legit asserting the behavior you wanted? So I do think be very careful of like, nowadays I'm more reverse engineering, like what are the SLAs of your platform components? What are the SLAs of your end user experience? And then working backwards, classic DORA metrics will get you started, but if you're not hitting those targets, then we need to improve the testing. Do you know what I mean? Rather than saying you must have 80, thou shalt have 80% code coverage, thou shalt do all this. Like I when I was CTO at places, I like to set broad goals. We've got 3 nines uptime, and we can have, no more than 2 incidents a month. And if we see those SLAs being breached, then it's like, what do we do to prevent that happening in the future? And then you work backwards. Oh, I need to do more regular testing. Yeah, right. So perhaps we do need some kind of rough code coverage metric to get you started on thinking of that mindset. But to answer your actual main question there, really, as well, is the platform should be an enabler for that in my mind, because like all the frameworks, all the languages, the code, tools have got a lot of this stuff baked in. But how do you make it easily provisional and easy to run? Do you know what I mean? Like again, a
Yeah.
lot of customers I'm working with, like we will work with the engineers, like what kind of testing frameworks do you like, how do you want to run them, and then we'll give them advice on how you should create a platform that you can self-serve those things. Do you know what I mean? I don't want to be doing a ServiceNow ticket to create up some provisioning environment, some like dev environment to test. That should be automated. Like how do you run like tests as part of your like deployment process? Like that should all be automated. So we focus a lot on making it easy to do the right thing with the platform toolset.
Yeah, and I think that's some of the challenges we're seeing with our customers and users, why they come to us, is kind of when they move to cloud native and they start maybe experimenting with a more async way to deploy or deploy software, and they testing just at the regular kind of as part of the build process, pre-artifact is just not enough. And then you're looking at how do we inject testing into kind of our GitOps process or progressive delivery
Yeah,
or
definitely,
all
definitely.
these
Yep,
kind of
yep.
things.
Love it.
And they're kind of, that's partially why they, what we think we can help with our product. But I'm guessing, to your point, if you can provide a platform that kind of gives them the framework or scaffold to do GitOps, to do progressive delivery, to do, IAC or whatever, however you deploy, and gives you clear insertion points for your tests, and maybe is even opinionated on which testing tools to use. I guess this is like a point of discussion. I think that platform engineering can be a huge enabler for better testing, whatever frameworks you decide to use.
Yeah, big plus one. And like again, so like the framework I work on is called Kratix. And the big difference with Kratix and a lot of other platform frameworks is that you have to do the work in curating your experience. But once you do, it is customized to your experience. And I like what you were saying. I almost had you saying like you have like key points, like I need to generate an S bomb there, like a software bill of materials. I need to run a resilience check here. I need to do like a other check here. But that a lot is quite standard, but a lot of the actual implementation is custom to the org. Do you know what I mean? So you almost want like a sort of hooks and slots type framework, so, going back
Mm-hmm.
to the old design pattern days. But like, we know we want to do some form of like feature assertion here. Does the thing actually do it, what it says it does? We need to do some kind of security tests here, some kind of load tests here. But we found like all the customers we work with, they're all subtly different. They're all very similar, but subtly different,
But
right?
just yeah, there's just somehow subtle difference which throws you totally off the track sometimes. Yeah.
That's it. That's like the founders of Syntasso really learned that everyone wants a platform. Everyone needs a platform. There's a lot of benefits of the platform, but it has to be a platform for your organization. And the same with the testing. It's all sort of like turtles all the way down. Like everyone knows there should be testing, right? But it's unique to your org. So I think a lot of focus I've been sort of a lot of time and energy I've been putting into focus at the moment is on helping folks understand what their requirements are and then baking that into the platform. So it is, again, I keep saying this, but so it's easy to do the right thing. Like, that's
Mm,
a phrase I use a lot when I'm chatting to
mm,
customers. They want some off the shelf, like soup to nuts kind of the system. I'm like, well, your architecture is subtly different than perhaps that system was optimized for. That
mm,
system was optimized for a monolith. Well, if you got a monolith, testing is really simple. You just spin it up in a process, you run some tests against it, happy days, pass or fail. Exactly to your point, Ali. Like when you're dealing with a distributed system like microservices, like serverless, like you really need to be doing testing in production as well as you do like pre-release.
mm,
And that stuff, it's a mindset shift. You need a platform that supports all that stuff. And we do a lot of coaching around that.
mm. Okay, you brought up something I wanted to ask you about. So testing in production specifically, it's a
Yeah,
little bit of a hot potato.
indeed.
I've heard in previous discussions. Some advise against it, but and I would also do that as your only way of testing. But it does seem to be pretty common as that you would do testing, of course, along the CI/CD process workflow
Yeah, yeah.
pipeline. But ultimately, we do see a lot of people actually running tests in production as kind of a safety net. As you could contrast it to like just a monitoring, I guess, or a synthetic
Exactly.
monitoring. And
Yeah, yeah.
I guess, there's a line to draw. When is it synthetic monitoring? When is it testing in production? For what we see is people use it especially to speed up their development, their loops, right? So say, let's, instead of injecting our end-to-end tests in each of our pull requests, ephemeral environments, let's do them in a later phase. It could be in progressive delivery if you're doing that,
Yep,
but
yep.
it could also be then just after you've actually deployed. What are your thoughts there? Do you kind of, as a red flag, or do you feel like you pragmatic? Well, if you combine it with this or that, it's actually not a bad idea.
Yeah, I think there's sort of a range of options in it. And I do when I'm chatting to folks, I'm like, what are you optimizing for at the moment? Like startups, like with limited amount of customers, like you can probably like optimize for speed, and if stuff breaks, well, we'll just do a little bit of testing in prod, like it's kind of fine. I've definitely seen a whole bunch of folks arguing for like design for replaceability, and they hardly do any tests on the individual components, but do end-to-end testing like in prod effectively. Fine if you've got like two customers or whatever, right? And if it does thing blows up, you just fix it, happy days. But you imagine like a big bank or a big airline doing that, like you got to do all the things in that, right? You got to do a whole bunch of pre-release testing, but I would also argue you've got to do a whole bunch of like in prod testing, because as the joke that charity majors make, it's like if you don't test in production, your users do.
Yes, well,
Do you know what I mean? So like when Charity said that in a pithy way, I was like, yeah, it totally makes sense. So it is a mindset shift. I think there's a like particularly in these big organizations, there's always a fear of risk management, or how do you
mm,
handle risk management? And the word testing in production, they're like, well, testing often fails and it breaks stuff and whatever, right? Like, well, I can't have that in production. And it's like, no, that's kind of the wrong way to think about it. Do you know what I mean? You're like, you have to really optimize for like getting that fast feedback. If you're if a key value driver in production fails, like a user can't, check their bank account or transfer money, buy a product, whatever it is, someone should be alerted to that straight away. It doesn't matter if the database is blowing up, all these other things. Like if a customer facing thing is broken, that's really important, isn't it? So I think for me, like optimizing, whether it's monitoring, synthetic monitoring, whether it's testing and production, call it what you will, I want to know if something's not working in prod, I want to know as fast as possible. So I think like you can do all the testing you like up front, but in a distributed, complex, adaptive system, stuff's just going to happen, right? I think
Yeah.
you've seen this probably more than I have.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
stuff just happens, so you need to be testing like the sharp end of the stick, right, where the users are actually using the stuff.
Yeah, and you never. I mean, since you're especially in a cloud native setting, your application in production is built on a very complex infrastructure. So the
Totally.
things can happen in your infrastructure like that you can't really be always be prepared for. I'm sure you can do chaos testing if you want.
Yeah.
If you're that, if but I think to me it still does make sense if you have some end-to-end tests that don't alter the state of your system or that kind of have any side effects. Provisioning
Yes.
those to actually run on an hourly basis in your production environment doesn't mean you shouldn't run them before, especially like you're
Yeah. Yeah.
saying if it's a business critical. But you never know, all right? We've always seen these things. Worked on my machine is a bad example, but it worked in the staging environment and it worked in our progressive delivery pipeline. But then for some reason it's failing here. And just being on the same. And today it's reasonably easy to automate the execution of tests. There's a cost aspect maybe too, but that could definitely be worth the investment to minimize risk or to kind of be on top of things early.
Yeah, I hear it. I don't know if you've seen this as well, but the trick I used, did some behavior-driven develop or behavior testing, and we were actually reusing that. There was stuff that we'd done sort of pre-release actually in production. Do you know what I mean? So we would like create some like sort of end-to-end, like the system must do this, and then we'd run it. We'd actually the same automation framework, just target dev or target prod. I mean, like, is that something you've seen as well? Like, do folks you're working with actually like rerun some scripts in like dev and prod?
Oh, definitely. Oh, definitely. So I
Interesting,
think they're
interesting.
even trying to design their tests to be reusable across dev and prod.
Hmm.
So, like I said, it depends on kind of what effect the side effect your tests have on the system. I mean, some tests, need a very specific
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
data setup, scaffold, whatever. Others are more not as sensitive and won't, inject a million users. It's more like so. But to your point, you'd have to design for that, right? So it's
Yeah.
in a staging or ephemeral environment, you could do whatever you want because that'll be torn down. You'll have to be a little bit more cautious when you're actually doing things in production.
Yeah, yeah, interesting.
Another thing I wanted to ask you about is something that we also see more with TestCube is around infrastructure testing. So
Mm.
specifically in platform engineering, where teams are dynamically provisioning new infrastructure. So what they do is they set up tests to test that infrastructure before they either deploy the application or hand that infrastructure over to the team that's ultimately going to use it. And that infrastructure testing could be like making sure the right hardware has been provisioned, like GPUs for AI workloads or something like that, but also just making sure that, I don't know, Prometheus or whatever else is installed in those clusters. Is that something I mean, you can do that as part of your Helm charts, I'm sure, and as part of kind of tools that are out there. Do you see people see that at all? And what are your thoughts?
Yeah, we do, at least. So in like Kratix, we have this notion of promises which have pipeline workflow. So as you're delivering something, you can do arbitrary steps in that pipeline. So we see particularly the more advanced customers doing verification. They do policy along the way. So like they use Open Policy Agent to say, all infrastructure code generated must have like a security setting or, must be encrypted or whatever. But they like to run assertions on that on what gets built. So they're running sort of like tests along the pipeline of is the code generated conforming to what we've specified, and then when it's being applied, there's a framework called Gatekeeper. It runs sort of Gatekeeper, which checks like your sort of policies in Kubernetes, and then they often, or not often, but they sometimes do checks on the actual Kubernetes cluster and the names can be that have been provisioned. But it's a little my personal take is it's a sort of love-hate relationship with all this infrastructure testing, because often these days infrastructure is so declarative in nature. If you're using Terraform, that kind of stuff, cloud formation, that kind of stuff. That it reminds me of when I was working in Ruby many years ago, that your tests were so similar to your code that like they were so brittle. Do you know what I mean? Like, 'cause you're basically declaring a state and then you're asserting that the declaration is valid. And it's like, hang on, like, and then you make a small tweak to the infrastructure generation and suddenly all your tests break. So I'm more of a fan of running those like later stage pipeline tests. Do you know what I mean? Have some policy checks along the way, but run those big picture tests of like, is there enough storage space provisioned? Because often you find like people are evolving, we call it promise, but evolving a service over the years, gradually putting more and more stuff onto their infrastructure, onto their compute node, and they'll run out of like disk space, as an example. Time you got some login turned on. So you actually want to, once you provision the node, run some verification of like, is the CPU available? Is the memory available? That kind of stuff, rather than just asserting the code along the way. Because that for me is a nice balance of like sort of local testing is what I'm generating correct? Versus global testing, is the thing actually going to run in prod when I provision it? After you, and imagine like it's not a day one thing, it's a day two, day 365 thing, where you've piled on all this extra cruft onto that initial small service and it no longer boots up because like it has no disk space, for example, right?
No, and well, that makes sense. And I'm also thinking if you're like using a cloud provider that provides a bunch of auxiliary services to your clusters or to your infrastructure. I don't know what the. I'm sure they promise that things aren't going to change unexpectedly, but I'd probably maybe it goes back to what you were saying earlier. It depends on how mission critical these things are, and that if you want to put certain things into place to make sure that these ports are open or I'm on a specific version of some dependency just to really nail things down and to have repeatability in kind of the deployment process that you have. So, but it is interesting because the concept of infrastructure testing wasn't something that I had really seen a lot before, but it does seem like now that people are provisioning infrastructure almost like applications
That's
or
it.
like so you need to test that as well. But I definitely hear you on.
Different mindset required. That's one thing I would say. Like back sort of like my coding days, that like you test sort of like like this test pyramid is the classic test pyramid, and I think the test pyramid is less valid for infrastructure just because a lot of it is declarative in nature. Like if you're coding like in Pulumi and other things, CDK and Amazon, then maybe you do want to do more of a classic software architecture kind of and testing approach. But I just think the declarative stuff is by nature it's declaring the state and then you're asserting on the state, and it's like never quite sat right. When I was writing a whole bunch of Puppet and other things back a few years ago now, I found my tests look remarkably like my implementation code, and I was like, that's a bit of a bad smell. But I do think like the need to verify along the way, and I think something you hinted at earlier is like verify contracts. Sometimes I don't know if you see that, but I remember again 10 years ago when I was doing early microservice systems, like we were doing consumer-based contracts in some places, and we also had like consumer tests running or tests running against third-party APIs because they did just change like randomly. Like I remember this was a mail like a mail label generator service, and they just changed the API every so often. So we actually ran tests against that every night, asserting
Oh,
the
just to make
API
sure
did
they
not
hadn't made
differ.
any changes. Yeah.
Yeah, and then if it did, it flagged in Jenkins, like
Mm.
the API's changed, right?
Yeah.
So like that kind of, I don't know if you see many service contract verification like things these days, but I think there's a lot of value in
But that
asserting
totally
contracts.
makes sense, and I would say those services are part of your application infrastructure, or it depends on how what you think is infrastructure. But definitely any external dependency, be it hardware or software, that is required to be in place and behave in a certain way for your application to run. So doing like pact or some kind of contract
That's it.
based
Yeah,
testing
that's what we did. Yeah,
makes
yeah,
I think is still a very valid. I think we always live in this bubble, where we're like design first and
yeah, yeah.
all these kind of. But in reality, to your point, APIs change and things change, and I mean, it's the same for us and with our product. It kind of evolves,
Yeah.
and sometimes you just
Same.
forget that, or you don't even consider that there could actually be someone depending on this. So cool. So I just want to go back once more to what we talked about initially on culture and testing, because testing is usually something that you do late in your process, right?
Yeah.
Do you think platform engineering there has a role to play and to try to help or can facilitate test teams to embrace testing early on in their process? It does feel like I'm repeating myself, but still, I don't want to go back to it because I think that's if you think so, I think that's actually a really big thing, because testing is usually something you don't do in the beginning, and then when it's time to do it, it's kind of overwhelming, and it either sucks up your resources or you don't do it thoroughly as you would have done.
Yeah, I think platform engineering and like any sort of like tooling creation can be an enabler of cultural change. Like for me, a sort of you need to get that bottom up buy-in of like what's the right thing here to do, but then baking it into your tools, really, to your point, or baking it into your platform, making it easier for the folks that are following behind in my footsteps or that aren't so interested in testing or security checks or whatever, making it easy for them to do the right thing is a winner. And that, I think, over time, if you can like build the tool set that supports that, the culture comes with it. You definitely need some top-down encouragement, incentivize folks, don't get me wrong, all those good things. But looking back at my consulting career, we would try and create cultural change by showing people what good looks like and like creating a path for them, but like getting folks to walk that path often required tooling, often required changes in approach of like coding stuff or testing stuff. So in my mind, platform engineering is like a natural evolution of things like DevOps and other methodologies are in that space of just making it easy for everyone to do the right thing. Do you know what I mean? And I think platform engineering operates more in the infrastructure layer, but it's sort of the gap between infrastructure and say the application developers. So it is a really powerful lever. If you can get it right, it can really help the infrastructure folks, expose all their services and the testing and all the contracts, all this kind of stuff to the developers in a kind of self-service manner that is just much easier to do the right thing.
So, okay, on that note, so platform engineering can be a key enabler and driver for good testing in cloud native. Daniel Bryant, this has been awesome. Thank you so much for joining me and talking about this and sharing your so valuable insights. And thank you, everyone listening. Hoping you'll listen to future episodes. Thank you, everyone. And thank you, Daniel.
Thanks, Ali. Always good to chat.
Okay, take care. Bye-bye.
Bye now.